Welcome back, everybody. This is a panel discussion talking about statistical agencies, official statistics, where are we going with our confidentiality and privacy. I'm very pleased that John agreed to be on the panel because he was on the Tuesday panel and he agreed to come back for the Thursday panel. So John Abowd from the U.S. Census Bureau and Jörg Drechsler from the IAB, I don't know what that stands for, in Nuremberg, Germany, and Frauke Kreuter, I can't even, University of Maryland, Mannheim, IAB, so lots of affiliation. So I sort of put together a few sort of preliminary questions just to focus the conversation, but of course our panelists are free to bring up any other issues that they would like to discuss. But my sort of motivating questions were about the challenges and the obstacles for statistical agencies to consider, more formal privacy models. And of course, the agencies are well grounded in disclosure limitation approaches, which are basically based on the risk of re-identification. And do we need to continue with these sort of common practices, common disclosure limitation practices that are mostly on the whole non-perturbative methods for protecting the data? Do we need to still think about disclosure risks in terms of linkage attacks or risk identification or singling out, which we heard the other day? How do we convince the statistical agencies and the user community to accept perturbation? So this is not a very common thing and a very big obstacle in statistical agencies to start actually changing the data after they work so hard to collect it and to have such good data, and then we go and mess it up. So it's a very big problem. And then, of course, the issue of the current legislation, which is about re-identification, and do we need to think about lobbying our legislation, the government, that this is really, there's no way you can avoid re-identification in this digital age when everybody has got fingerprints all over the internet, and maybe we should start moving towards something more similar to the notion of differential privacy and inferential disclosure, and not try and guarantee that every single person in our database can't be re-identified, because that's hopeless. But so those are sort of the motivating questions, and I'm the moderator, so I'm going to let the panelists speak, and of course you're free to bring up any other topics.
Do you have a
Frauke?
okay.
Yeah.
All right. This was fun, and it's even more fun since John is the only one really at official statistical agency. But I guess, well, we are sort of associated.
I always thought that Jörg was at a real statistical agency.
Well, we're all associated with some, and certainly interact with a lot of them, and so hopefully can shed some light on the discussions internally. What I thought might be useful, just you alluded to this a little bit this morning, but to give a little bit of context from the European perspective, which is quite different than what we face here. And what struck me listening to this week's discussions and the bootcamp and discussions on the side is that aside from the Scandinavian countries, to which Jörg will say something in a moment, but in Central European countries, in particular Germany, which we know best, or I know best, the discussion is quite different because we do not have a tradition of microdata being out in a public use file fashion, right? So there is no icons, there is no criminal record data that you look at it. You can't look up housing prices. You can't. There's a lot of things. Voting records. I mean, every time I tell someone at home that you can look up voting records here, they're falling off their chairs. It's like it's inconceivable that could be in the public space. And so, so what the statistical agencies and other program agencies in many of these countries are trying to do right now is to push a little bit the data into a more user-accessible space, but that meaning they're pushing them into research data facilities, right? And that's still I mean, so in that sense, that is still the majority of the discussion. And interestingly, I have seen very little trying to figure out how could we go beyond. there is a big discussion on how to scale that process, right? So at the IAB, the Research Data Center has right now about 1,200 users and roughly 700 projects, and they have every month about 1,000 outputs they try to review. And they have every day one person working on it for 3.5 hours, right? That's sort of the scale at which they operate. And all right, and right now they're dealing with about 80% of these output control requests automatically through a system that sort of proves the tables. But those are outputs that are used internally for further thinking about the project, and discussion. Outside publications are all reviewed manually. But so anyway, that's the bottleneck they see. But most of the discussion goes in that direction. And so your policy questions are very difficult to answer in that space because the mindset is in a completely different place. I've checked in with a couple of other statistical agencies that I know a little better, and the comment I got from Belgium to your question was like, oh my God, this is so far beyond anything we can currently think about. We have no resources to even understand what that would mean for us, and quite different in Canada. They have more resources and follow more closely what the US does, but they too, they are thinking of, I guess they follow quite closely what happens with respect to the census, and that might be the first place they're thinking about. But in general, they too have, over the last couple of years, pushed much more towards the use of administrative data in that context. And so, last sentence I wanted to say, with the administrative data, to me, in many contexts that what I've seen, if you look at the statutes with which these administrative data can be used, they are often so closely tied to a policy case for which the admin data were collected, right? So you need, like just as a case study, if I want to do some methods research on data on the unemployment, on the wage records that the IRB has for research purposes, I have to show to the Ministry of Labor a clear labor market research context and reason in order to get access to the data, right? Even for an internal project, right? So there is already a loop and project review similar to what you would see in an RDC that we can legislatively not get around. And if I want to do a method study to sort of, test some statistical methods or what have you, unless it's tied to a labor market question and I can demonstrate that it would help labor market policy, I don't get access to the data. So there is a restriction that would make it very unlikely anytime soon that these data could ever be outside the research data center to begin with. I guess that's my intro.
Thank you, Jörg.
Okay, yeah, so what I found very very funny and enlightening yesterday over lunch when we had these the meeting with John, somebody asked, do you get any useful inputs from other statistical agencies in other countries about differential privacy? And I think John's answer was pretty clear that he said no, they are all coming to me. And that's exactly the situation we are in. I think that currently I feel all other statistical agencies, at least the ones I know about, they basically would say right now, let's see what happens at the census. And then, we'll see what we will do about it, right? So they are very passive. I think there's a lot of interest. Everybody's following what's going on here, but it's not like there's real active research in other statistical agencies. And I think what's also important in this context, I think, is always to keep in mind that all these discussions about privacy, confidentiality, they are so much influenced by the cultural background of the different countries, and that's what Frauke already alluded to when she mentioned the Scandinavian countries. Because in the Scandinavian countries, basically, you can always have all the data, and nobody cares. It's really like they always laugh when they hear what other statistical agencies are doing. Even the small things that happen in Europe at other statistical agencies, because they say, you know, why do you care? I mean, everybody can have our data in our country, and there's no, I mean, nobody's really concerned about it. They just don't feel like this is problematic in any way. And if you're in such a situation, of course, then to them, this idea of, you know, we need to alter everything and we, you know, need to infuse noise and all that, it seems just not a necessary thing to even think about. And I mean, I think that this has important consequences. And in Germany, particularly, we also have a special situation in terms of research access. So there's a differentiation even in the law between whether it's public use data or whether it's data that should only be used by scientific researchers. So if a scientific researcher asks for access, the only thing that needs to be ensured is, there's a differentiation in the law between what do they call it? They call it absolutely anonymous, whatever that's supposed to mean. I don't think any data can ever be absolutely anonymous, but that's the one thing. So this would be for the general public. And then there's something called de facto anonymous, which means, and I think that's an interesting interpretation, it basically is always interpreted like this, that the amount of effort that would be necessary to identify someone in the database or learn something about someone in the database is higher than the gains you get in terms of the information that you learn now about that individual. And the argument then is, you know, in many of these data sets, this information that is in there is really not that interesting in and of itself. So in the sense, if you think about all these efforts that would be necessary to run these kind of reconstruction attacks, and then you don't learn too much. The idea is, you know, there's just an imbalance between the two, and so in that sense, we don't even need to think about these situations. But then it comes back to, and I think that's also important, it comes back to the question, how sensitive is my data? Because I think with differential privacy in general, this question is no longer the relevant question, because we just ensure that, you know, whatever the question is, it won't differ too much whether the unit is in the database or not. It's not about how sensitive is that question that is answered. It's just, it holds in general, right? Whereas with this specific definition, we are back in the situation where we should think about, is that sensitive information or not, or how sensitive is that information? Which I think changes a little bit the way we think about that problem. But nevertheless, I mean, there's a lot of interest in differential privacy. And I think one thing that I also wanted to touch on a little bit, because it's one of the questions that Natalie raised in terms of, you know, what is necessary that the users would accept perturbed data. Right? And I think, I mean, from my own experience, I did a lot of work on synthetic data in general. So the ideas related to Don Rubin that have been mentioned a while ago in some of the talks today and yesterday. And the basic thing is that users will not accept the data as long as they don't know what the impacts of the perturbation are. And it's not like, I don't think it even helps if you show them some results. So this is what is generally done with synthetic data. You would say, you know, we run a couple of regressions and a couple of analyses and say, you know, this is what you have gotten from the original data. This is what you get from the synthetic data. It's close, so my synthetic data is probably good. Still, nobody would use the data because they say, but how do I know that my analysis I'm interested in, how do I know that this one is really close to the one I would have gotten from the original data? And so I think it's very important, or in my view at least, an important direction, and Ashwin I think pointed to that too, is that we need to think about that we can make sure that we always know what are the exact impacts for a specific type of analysis based on the noisy data, so that I know, you know, will the results be biased? And if yes, how much can I correct for that? And can I quantify the amount of error? And not in terms of, this is the maximum error that I might expect, but really, what is the amount of error for this specific type of analysis? I think this would be important things to make that more appealing to users of the data.
Thank you. John?
I want to remind you that I'm speaking for myself. So I want to make a couple of very quick points, and then I know you guys have lots of questions. First, every major product from the U.S. Census Bureau uses perturbative methods and has for decades. I'm not sure why that isn't well understood, but perhaps it's because we wish to distinguish between perturbations that can be written down with probability laws and perturbations that can't, but because we don't reveal the way in which the complementary suppression is done in standard disclosure limitation systems, from the point of view of the user, that is random. And therefore, virtually every statistical product released by every national statistical office in the world uses perturbative methods. That's point one. Point two is sort of what Jörg was saying. It is the case that many of the data products that are produced by statistical agencies are about things that there's a widespread view are important for society, they are important for good government, and for the well-being of the people for whom the statistics were collected. And therefore, the good actors in the society do not demonstrate that those methods are in fact unsafe. Now, that is starting to change, and one of the reasons why we did it ourselves inside the Census Bureau is because it was clear to us that if we didn't, we were just going to be waiting for what happened this week to ABS to happen to us, somebody outside. It was a good actor who did it for ABS, did it on a simulated data set, and then showed that in the simulated data set you could recover the real record. So there's a role for good actors in helping the statistical agencies understand that the mathematical basis for suppression is a subtraction attack, and a subtraction attack is a special case of a reconstruction attack, and the tables are vulnerable to other kinds of reconstruction attacks, and if they are sufficiently detailed, those reconstruction attacks can be incredibly accurate images of the underlying data. Those are sort of things that I think the statistical agencies need to admit right now, and they need to say the perturbative method that we have relied on the most, primary and complementary suppression, is perturbative because we can't tell you how to correct the biases, and the biases matter. There's a very widely used data set published by another statistical agency in the United States where more than half of the value of the underlying entities is suppressed by the combination of primary and complementary suppression, and researchers routinely use the rest of it as if that was somehow missing at random. The agencies, I'm speaking for myself, the agencies have an obligation to their community to come clean about what statistical disclosure limitation actually does, and to use methods that allow external consumers of the data to be confident that the data can be meaningful and speak to the hypotheses. We have to stop pretending that we did nothing but little light touch, scrub it around the edges. And let me say, now, that is often true, but it's far from always true. So in exchange for the good actor not attacking the statistical agency's databases, the statistical agency should own up to the vulnerability. Now, we don't have a solution for everything, so we need a way to collaborate on developing more solutions. And I think weeks like this and this whole semester-long program, they're an enormous step forward. I believe that while it is an important step in changing the way statistical agencies behave, that the Census Bureau is going to apply differential privacy to the 2020 census, that it's not the heroic act that some people think. It was a necessary response to a vulnerability. And if somebody like me had walked in and peered into the IT system at the Census Bureau and said, that crypto was safe in 1990, but it's not safe now, the only response would have been to close off the system it was on, update the crypto. That's why we do the security scans. We did a security scan of our disclosure limitation procedures. It revealed a vulnerability, and we adopted the best available technology. A decade from now, I'm certain that this will not be the best available technology, not the principle, but the specific algorithms. So the deal ought to be, come clean about the limitations of traditional disclosure limitation, and make a good faith effort to continue to protect the products appropriately. That's all I wanted to say by way of background.
Great. Okay, let's open the floor.
So, Frauke mentioned, you touched upon the sort of review process that happens for researchers coming to a research data facility with questions they want to ask of the data. And my question is, do we anticipate formal privacy methods making that review process easier or more difficult? So, at first, you would like to think it would make it easier because you have this, you don't need to review the disclosure limitation methods, the outputs don't need to scrutinize them in the same way. On the other hand, it forces you to confront this difficult social choice question about the value of the question being asked against the amount of the budget being consumed. And I'm just curious where you kind of see this in the near term and the long term.
Yeah. So I think the interesting point is, where does that conversation happen, right? And this wouldn't be a choice that has any effect if the statistical agency or the subsidiary that we are would make. It would not make a difference at all. Right? The place where the change would need to happen is the legislation around the collection of the wage records and similar administrative data, right? Because I was about to name the paragraphs in the German legislation, which I realize is meaningless here. So anyway, but they clearly specify that these data can be stored and used for scientific purposes, but only with this specific use case, right? And someone mentioned that earlier, that GDPR, not surprisingly, highly drafted by or chaired by a German, has some of that spirit. It's all sort of use case related, right? And so I think this can be an interesting discussion, but it's a discussion we would need to have with someone completely different. It's not, or maybe via the statistical agencies with, legislators on these programmatic data. But that's the place where the problem hangs. It's the usage. Which reminds me actually of one thing that you said, Jörg, and I think that's where this formal guarantee actually holds great promise. You said, well, the sensitivity depends on a data item. I don't know if Helen is still here, but she would say, well, it also depends on the use case and who is using it, right? And since you can't specify that for every single item, because in a different context it might be perceived more sensitive than another, But that's not evaluated. The sensitivity for this, the only goal is like, what are you doing with it, and will it help? So on your time frame question,
evaluate for disclosure on the outputs.
The ones that hold the data and responsible for that, yes, we review for the disclosure and the output. But they are responsible for doing so, and they do that. I mean, that's why I mentioned these numbers, so that you get a sense of scale, right? I mean, we are a smaller country, less happening, I guess. But a lot, given the small size of the agency. But the Ministry of Labor, who makes the decision on whether the data can be used or not, right? They have an umbrella trust to us that we do the disclosure control. So these are two different steps, I guess. And to your time frame, in order to change that legislation, it takes time. You know, that's
So I just wanted to ask John, so I never considered cell suppression to be a perturbative method, because that's not actually changing, it's just, you know, deleting information. So it's interesting, but it is true that, you know, the Census Bureau has been doing record swapping. Now that is actually altering the data in a very perturbative method, although I'm sure they're not doing very much of it.
What do you say about your complementary suppression algorithms?
So I have a table, and probably the whole table is going to be 0, but I am deleting the values in the cell. I'm not actually adding noise or altering them in any ways.
You modify the distribution of the data from the point of view of the user according to a randomness that you induced, not the data generating process.
I think that John Friedman's example yesterday illustrates this very well, that because of the cell suppression, they got a very different view about the population.
Well, that's true. I mean, to me, that's.
Yeah.
So the source of the randomness, is in the algorithm and the secretiveness about how the algorithm was applied. But from the point of view of the user, how is that any different from any other non-ignorable missing data mechanism?
no. And I think that, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think what you said in your statement and just now, I think if we think of ways to convey, I feel like that's one big missing piece, right? To demonstrate, and we've discussed this at length, you know, before, to demonstrate with the existing set false conclusion that might have been made, or, you know, missing information. I mean, it's that teasing apart that as survey methodologists we always try to do, you know, put a value on all these error sources that go in there, largely ignored, always the focus on sampling error, but, you know, it's all kinds of stuff in there, right? And I mean, one problem, of course, is that stuff is still there, even with the added noise, but it could help to create a level of comfort that some information is still better than none information. But I do feel like that some of these discussions go sort of sideways because you're purely talking about the published tables, right? And
It's about outputs, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Thomas, yeah.
So this is a question for John. You were talking about the comparison between the perturbation of differential privacy and the perturbation of previous techniques. You know, there's a comparison because the previous techniques are not openly available. So I guess sort of a question would be, you know, if you guys had simply secretly implemented differential privacy, not told anyone about it, do you think you know, people would complain less?
I'm trying to 0.1 dp my answer. Let's just say that at every single first presentation, one of the options openly considered and discussed was not to talk about this in public. Mm-hmm. So it is a view that sort of like the security of your cyber system, because we can't get hard proofs that you've set a cyber system up securely. We have to use best practices. If you treat this like best practice, then you might say, well, it's been best practice in disclosure limitation to do it and just tell the users that you've done it and let them. But I think this is fundamentally different in that this gets its strength from the ability of the users to confirm that you did that. That's why you released the code. We're still struggling. You should help us with this. We're still struggling about what the kinds of proofs of execution we can release when we release the code, so that your belief that we actually we actually have built in some DP tests to make sure the people we gave the code to ran it. But what if you can establish that your declaration is sufficiently trustworthy that you did do this, then it can be verified that the quantitative guarantee that comes with DP is reflected in these data, then it is best practice at that point to say, I'm going to forget about it. I'm not going to ever worry again about whether this particular product is less safe than when I released it, which is not the case for the historical systems. We keep paying attention to them for quite some time.
Let me add one comment. The funny thing is you could also do that the other way around, right? It's not only about keeping secret how you protected the data, but sometimes there are discussions whether it would be sufficient if you publish results, say a scatter plot or regression results that nobody really knows anyway how to really figure out what the risks are there, and just write underneath it, data have been altered sufficiently to protect the information, but don't do anything at all. It's just this perceived protection that happened that people would not even think about, this is still the real data, right?
I'm sorry, but I can't imagine the people who go around breaking things for fun wouldn't play with that and detect that you had in fact done nothing and embarrass you significantly, not to mention compromise the privacy of the people in the data set.
Right, sure. I mean, if you would then really go back and, yeah, I agree. It was just, yeah.
One thing following up on what you just said, people going around breaking things for fun. I mean, yes. One on the how to convince people side that this is a good thing or worthwhile considering for some of these agencies, I think it gets hard sometimes to have this discussion with data like census data that have, at least by now, because Germany has such a terrible census history and unsuccessful longer census, also only small pieces of information in it. To convey sort of the harm or the risk that could happen to individuals. But I do think one strategy to launch that discussion more aggressively would be to talk about firm level data. Firm industry level data. And that was one of Jörg's projects on creating synthetic data files, was because there it's like everyone sees the risk immediately, and there we have a huge non-response, at least in Germany, because these surveys are not really mandatory or never enforced and therefore basically voluntary. And they have terrible response rates. I mean, 15, 20, 30%, and if the general perception would change that my firm level data are safe, then who knows? Maybe we would indeed get more response, right? That would be an interesting use case.
I was going to change the subject a bit. Do you want to finish off on this?
So you go right ahead first.
Okay. The comment was made earlier about issues of allocating privacy budget and kind of picking winners and losers. And I'm wondering, is there anything, isn't that something that we've been doing for years? It's just being done in advance when you design the collection and design them, kind of a design methodology decision, but is it really any different?
So you mentioned that in your talk, I believe, John, I heard you say that. I think you're absolutely right. If it is a survey-based data collection, there are a lot of decision going on. And, in unsafe neighborhoods, it's much harder to convince interviewers to make 20 contact attempts as it is in safe neighborhoods, right? I mean, there's a lot of, things going on differentially, in a different differential way, but, as a function of your outcomes of interest or, different winners and losers. So I think on those data, yes, from the European perspective, it really is much more about the release and the use case for administrative data. And there I would say much less so, right? Because the collection system for administrative data, so data that are a byproduct of administrative processes, such as I am employed and therefore my employer has to report to the Social Security system my wage and start date and end date and those kind of data. They are much more uniform in the way they are collected and reported.
is there not a decision being made that certain things need to be reported there? And that there's presumably some cost associated with reporting those. Some things I can see going directly to, you have to have those for taxation, but others probably are being included in the requirements because of the planned use of these administrative records.
Unfortunately not, actually.
In the U.S., race and ethnicity, that's part of the OMB standard, but other than that, Frauke's right.
That's a big trouble that actually all the statistical agencies now face. So everyone would like to use more of the administrative data.
They don't have data.
But the records are often sparse in the sense that what's of interest from a statistical agency point of view or from a researcher that then uses those products they're often too sparse, and it's hard to impossible to get additional records on file. I mean, I know this one case in Germany where we tried to get part-time, full-time, part-time employment as part of the record system, and it feels like decades, several decades for this one variable. So it really is usually just what's necessary for the administrative process, and in the context of GDPR, that's actually even more likely to be the case because, again, it's so use case driven what you're even allowed to collect.
So I'd like to follow up on what Jörg said about the Scandinavian attitudes toward privacy. Why are the names deleted?
Why are what?
Are or not?
I mean, I'm just trying to push on this.
They still have, they're governed by the EU legislation, and but they have completely open registers. You don't even need a survey.
So it's even the case, I think. So first of all, what they do, which is interesting, which would not be possible in Germany. So they have a unique ID that you get when you're born, and then they link everything all the time. All these different administrative sources are all linked. And it's really true that you can ask for information even for specific persons if you want. It's not really like, they necessarily, I mean, I don't know if they would give you a whole data set with all the names attached to it, but if you want to find out about something about someone, you can ask for that.
And this is true no matter who the data analyst is, which also brings up the question of how do you get certified to be a researcher or whatever you...
This is actually independent of being a researcher. So these research regulations, this is specific for Germany, but in Scandinavia, this is much more...
So John, you were shaking your head, no, it's not true that arbitrary people could get this information.
That's right.
They get information from a register.
From a register, yeah.
But to get access to survey data, they'd have to be an approved researcher.
No, but the register data are super rich. I mean, this is your school records, any record throughout your life. So, and there anyone can get access.
So, in particular, our president couldn't have his school reports suppressed from this?
So I think you have to be a citizen.
Yeah, I mean, to get access to the data,
the system
true.
that way.
It's very easy to bribe a citizen to get access for you.
I didn't say that made it harder, but especially if you design a research proposal that makes large-scale statistical use of these things, there are still hoops to jump through.
Yes.
I was just curious, are there distinctions between the various Scandinavian countries, or they're all on the same page with this?
Good question. I don't know how, I mean, I can't really answer that.
I think Denmark is...
I only know that in general the Scandinavians are much more relaxed about the data and they share that. But in terms of
to the extent that Iceland counts as part of Scandinavia and the interest of Iceland for genetic researchers for their population. In terms of,
I think you're right. We shouldn't generalize by just saying Scandinavia, except to the extent that the registers have existed in the smaller Scandinavian countries for quite some time, and I have read discussions about the Swedish registers, and I have participated in analysis of the Norwegian registers. Probably most people in the room know about National Jealousy Day in Finland, which is when you can ask for the tax return of anybody in the country, and it is shown to you. So we're not making this up, Cynthia, but there is heterogeneity in the extent to which these can be used for large-scale statistical purposes and other things.
The United Kingdom is more similar, I think, to the United States in the sense that we don't have registers and we have a traditional census like we do in the United States. So you know, I was on a task force for this EU table builder, which I said is was based on every member state having to produce 150 very big multidimensional hypercubes. And it was very interesting sitting around a table because the ONS said, well, you know, you're going to get the 150 hypercubes with the record swapping, and Italy said, we'll give them to you, but we're going to round all the values. And Estonia said, here they are. You know, so it was so, and then maybe Germany, one country said we're going to suppress all, the Dutch, we're going to suppress all the cells, so basically we just get the margins. And how they're actually reconciling this table builder is, to me, is a, so I actually got kicked off the task force because I said, we don't need to touch these hypercubes, keep it behind your firewalls, and then when you query the table, we'll protect the table and add the, you know, round or add the noise or param or, and so I got, but no EU country would agree to actually release, you know, any tables that have not been perturbed to the to Eurostat. So, and now they're talking about again doing having a more consistent agenda, and they are looking at post-randomization, and they are looking at perturbing the zeros. So, we heard a little bit at the PSD conference, and of course I'll be seeing what's happening there for the next census.
Maybe one other thing that might be of interest. So we've been working with, you know, state and city agencies to for them to share their confidential microdata for analyses, and I mean I feel like there are these two waves, right? I mean, those that try to unlock these data and push for open data and open access and solutions to do that, similar to Salila, what you mentioned I think earlier in some of the discussion. But then the others that push for enclaves and more controlled environments, right? And I mean, it's hard for me to tell, you know, what could be a more successful strategy to unlock the data and allow more uses, or more bottom line use, let's put it this way. Whether it would be to convince them of, you know, releasing their microdata in the open with the privacy budget and or whether it would be an investment in a more controlled environment with basically similar story as your table builder, some control or perturbation at the end, right? And so far, because of this linkage, many of these reported similar statutory regulations, as I've heard from the Germans, because it is so often tied to our data can only be used if it is useful to X data generating process. The route in the data center, while it's still hard, seems still more logical, because then you know who wants to do what with the data, and you can basically make the argument this is helping us. Whereas the move towards the open data environment, then you lose that piece, right? So.
But there is legislation or, you know, move also within Europe to have more open data and more accessible data, and sort of these methods help in that direction. And so to me, this is not conflicting with the notion of approved researchers and RDCs. There's still always going to be that route, but we also have to think about more open access.
What is your controversial point? Are our statistical agencies collecting too much data? And B, is it like a whiplash effect? Because whenever you ask them, it's like, well, Facebook and Google collect so much, so shouldn't we be collecting a lot of data? So, can you sort of talk about this?
I mean, I can maybe talk a little bit about that. I think currently a lot of investments and research, at least at the statistical agencies I know about, go exactly in that direction, that they say, you know, what can we replace by just collecting data that's already lying around anyway, right? We don't need to collect all that data ourselves, because there's so much data available now in all the places, and this is no longer required. So they are looking for ways to get alternative data sources. The question, of course, is always the question of data quality, and that it's hard to be sure what the quality of the data is that this so-called found data that you can extract from the internet somewhere. And I think that is something where a lot of I think there's is a movement where it's currently not clear where this will end, because at least I think the statistical agencies are really looking into these opportunities, trying to get this information, but it's still this skepticism about the quality, and so there's a trade-off there, and it's a question: how good will the quality be that they can get from alternative sources? And of course, they will depend then on these alternative sources, which can be problematic in some cases.
We'll go with Sadia, because you raised your hand first, and then...
This is going back just to the previous discussion Mark was mentioning about the cities and states. And I wanted to just actually turn to John and find out whether you have any view on what's happening outside statistical agencies in the U.S., but in government, towards, for example, before Simpson, Garfinkel came to the Census Bureau, one of the last things he did at NIST was producing this document on de-identifying government data sets, which was motivated not just by what the problem confronted by statistical agencies.
So I have some limited knowledge of what's going on in the rest of government, and I know that the agencies are struggling to classify their data as human-related, and therefore I need to worry about de-identification versus not, and they have discovered that it's a continuum, and that the statistical agencies have expertise in a very narrow set of activities relative to what most government agencies generate data on. So that's going to be a very slow process, and there will be great benefits and certainly some mistakes made along the way. So the one thing I did want to respond to Ashwin by saying that statistical agencies have been very slow to acknowledge that their role as the primary manufacturer of statistical information in their societies was superseded. And we don't know exactly when the lines crossed, but the one where the external sources are the primary source is exponential, and it crossed the necessarily linear survey world inside statistical agencies probably sometime in the 2000s. But now the external line is so far above where a statistical agency is that they really can't even comprehend. I had an IT specialist at Census, a very good one, say, "Oh, we really got to worry about moving this to the cloud. We have almost a half a petabyte of data." And I'm pretty sure Google generates that in a few seconds, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the scale of the amount of digital information has not sunk in, and the statistical agencies themselves are not equipped to bring in specialists who can interact effectively with this world. Just building the cloud environment to do our disclosure limitation experiments on, you know how long it took. It took a year to get all the permissions in place before we could turn on the cloud. Dan came, told me what he needed, and he left, and we were almost there. So I think that is a really big issue. And redesigning the idea of producing statistics in the national interest, but from sources that are largely not designed by the statisticians inside those agencies, is a much bigger sea change than disclosure limitation, but it's happening at the same time.
And this is how Cynthia and I met, and certainly true for the long efforts that have been done in the U.S. federal statistical system. But just like John said, we shouldn't talk about Scandinavian countries all in one batch. That would be true for statistical agencies. I mean, it's important in those conversations to be clear on which country we're talking about, right? Because that's very different whether you are an agency that by and large collects a bunch of administrative data and creates statistics out of that, or whether it's all survey-based. But what is true, all of them, the heavy admin record-based systems as well as the survey-based system, they all look now to external third-party data and what could we learn from all the additional data that are generated.
Sasha, I think you had your hand.
I mean, I could be wrong, and Frauke maybe knows this better, but in my interaction with a number of social and behavioral scientists and clinical people who deal with clinical data, I think there's one group that we can't forget. Those are the actual researchers who are still very actively collecting data themselves. They are designing, they're running surveys, and the surveys the data they're collecting based on the surveys they're designing and running, they may also be interested in interacting with all the data that the government agencies are collecting and surveying. But then there's this whole additional a section of basically data availability, and it's not like everyone is turning just and saying, we're just going to use all the data that are available. There's still a lot of ongoing efforts on their own personalized kind of data collections for very specific purposes. And I think there is a great need, from my perspective, as much as there is for the large government agencies, large survey organizations to help in how we communicate about the privacy protection methods and the right analysis to do that, as much so to do with these researchers who are collecting data themselves, because they're trying to figure out data repositories within their libraries. Libraries are talking a lot about these issues, and nobody really knows what they're doing and what to do. And there's a great, I think, void or emptiness there and need, right?
I think you point to two interesting pieces there that I feel like might spur some research ideas or looking for gaps. You're absolutely right. Similar to what Jörg said earlier, even the agencies might never get there, that all of the information products they have to deliver can be done by existing sources. But certainly there are tailored research questions that can't be answered with them, without a doubt. But what you point to, I think, is an interesting question with respect to sort of privacy budget allocation and what have you, is that increasingly these data shall be linked, or at some point in the future will be linked to the more standard routine collected data, whether it's through administrative sources or larger statistical agency efforts. And it's not clear to me how this community thinks about that, right? Because it's some of that research, in fact, it is encouraged, that this linkage happens, because then you can, reduce the burden and all the arguments that you know well. And but that has been a trend, absolutely, and it probably will be important to think that through. Totally second your comment on more education needed for them on privacy, without a doubt.
This goes along with the expectation also by the funding agencies, which are government agencies, who are basically saying, well, you do have to share your data once you collect it, and in some cases, maybe 3 years you wait. In some cases, you're going to have to do it right away, make it available, right? So there are additional actors further pushing for data sharing, even if I'm the one who collected the data and I'm not linking it to anything that any product the Census is providing or any other government agencies, some other person who will end up using my data may. Right, so that's an area that, and again, if the tools are not there, I mean, in my conversations with those individuals and then groups, they're desperate.
I want to make one more point before we close. I think one, in terms of sort of sea change events in the space, at least in Europe's statistical offices, might be the current push to geocode all the data they have. I mean, even that, like at IRB, this happens, the wage records, and I mean, everyone is pushing, they discovered geolocation data and what that would mean for linkage, and they feel like this is much better than linking via name and birthday or whatever have you. And right now they're doing that sort of individually, and but I can see this coming, you know, that will likely change the discussion quite a bit. And so who knows, maybe that's the next avenue.
Does anybody want to raise any other points? If not, I want to thank our panelists very much, and thank you for generating interesting discussion.
Right, me too.